Almost a week after Election Day, from Broward to Palm Beach, from Manatee to the Panhandle, they are recounting ballots in 3 razor-thin races: governor, U.S. Senate, and agriculture. And there are hiccups, and it's a fair question to ask. Why does it keep happening here? Is it because Florida is split right down the middle, or we just don't know how to count well, or both? There's perhaps no better person to have perspective on this than Sarasota's own Katherine Harris, who was Florida's Secretary of State in 2000 and oversaw Bush versus Gore, the great Florida recount. Former Secretary, thank you so much for joining us, and also Congresswoman. So what about it? Why does it keep on happening here? Is it because we're such a closely divided state, or has there been systematic problems that have never been solved?
It's deja vu all over again, like Rodney Dangerfield would say. Florida's a purple state. We're going to have a close election. We do have close elections, as you've seen in history. And it's not a constitutional crisis, it's a close race. And thankfully, we have some of the best election laws in the nation to address this. And so that's where we start.
Well, they've been, there's been a lot of discussion that after 2000, we changed our election laws to try to avoid some of the court cases that we saw back in 2000, which you were very familiar of. But we still have a situation here where in Broward County there are issues in terms of the design of the ballot and so forth. And I guess what a lot of folks might be wondering is, why haven't we resolved that? Why isn't there any kind of uniformity in terms of how they design a ballot in Broward County and Sarasota County?
Okay, a little history, a little perspective. We have resolved that. The rule of law is the most critical, the bedrock principle of our nation, and we have to make sure that one follows the law. Secondly, after the recount, even before that, as a senator, I had proposed election reform legislation, and there was no political will to pass it. Certainly after election 2000, we got that bill passed, in addition to many, many other things, and it was heralded nationally as the model for election reform. I went and testified before Congress, and they all applauded it. Then you fast forward over the years, that it has been overhauled, so the election laws are sufficient to address this. We're talking about the law, but elected officials have to follow the law. Now, you and I were just discussing elections and being elected and what that means. We, at the very basic expectation, we expect our elected officials to have integrity and courage to follow the law, because no matter what you do in a situation like this, half of the country or half of the state is not going to be pleased. So at least following the law is your only safe harbor, at least that's what I felt like. And so at this point, for Broward and Palm Beach, they have come to issue before. What your listenership, your viewership should understand is that the supervisors of elections in each of the 67 counties are independently elected by each county. And because of that, they have autonomy there. They are constitutional officers. The Secretary of State does not have the authority over them, as it would be in other employees under the Department of State. Consequently, they have the sole autonomy over designing ballots. If you recall, Teresa Lepore and the butterfly ballot, that was very confusing. And now they're saying that the setup for these are confusing. They're constitutional officers. They have that opportunity. So should we address that? Are there best practices? Yes, indeed, there are.
That's the question. So we could understand that the supervisors of elections are independent of each other, but when we're talking about a ballot designed to avoid confusion, that like we saw in 2000 or that we saw in Broward County now, why can't the state weigh in and bring some kind of best practices, as you mentioned, or uniformity to the process?
Well, they certainly have that across the nation. They have best practices. They have best practices throughout the state. It's still up to the supervisor of elections to observe those. I think more importantly, you can't legislate integrity, and you can't legislate competence. These are issues that voters determine. And so we'll see as this moves forward. There have been issues in the past. I can't speak to those because I wasn't part of the case, but it's very disconcerting that the laws are not being observed. The reporting procedures did not occur as they were legislated to do. And in fact, we have legislated in Florida law who is allowed to vote.
Right.
So, and so I think what's important about that in terms of following the law is that if a felon votes in this election, not in the future, but in this election, their ballot is not counted. An illegal alien, they don't get to determine the future of our nation, our state. The signature blocks on absentee ballots, according to Florida law, must match. If you go to a bank and sign it dually and they don't match, you're not going to be able to cash the check, so that won't be counted.
Right.
So they have to follow the law as it's written. May not like it, but they can change it next year.
Right. A couple of really quick questions. In Bay County, the supervisor for elections is now confirming that over 140 vote by mail ballots came into his office either by fax machine or by email. I don't know if that's covered in the state statute, but that's now raising questions.
It will be covered in the state statutes, and so the Panhandle clearly was a different situation because
of the
hurricane. But the idea that they could get all of their reporting correctly and get everything in on time, it puts more of an emphasis on why the others can't.
Now, two quick questions here. Is this a matter of that things like this happen in every state all the time? Sometimes it takes longer than you would suspect to count the actual votes, but it's never really an issue unless it's a very close race.
That's why Florida will always stand out. As I said, we're a purple state. We have 2 constituencies that are very close in number. So Florida will always be at that pinnacle in deciding races.
And the other question is, as somebody who, you were in the middle of this in 2000, you see the politicization of this right now. Are you concerned that the impact of all of this may be that the public is less confident about our elections, and obviously that's not really good for the entire country?
I hope the public becomes more engaged. I hope they become more involved. I hope they become more educated and understand that the future of this country hinges on their vote, and so they will understand the process better.
All right, Katherine Harris, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Katherine Harris is the former Secretary of State for the state of Florida. Thank you for joining us tonight.